hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, DeLaune. It's such a pleasure being here. And Ben Cheever, whom I adore, a good friend, and really did a lot. He really made this. He made this book possible, as I spell out in my acknowledgments. That I think he feels is a mixed blessing, be that as it may. It may surprise you that Cheever drank quite a lot as an adult. Part of this he came by, honestly. His grandfather, Aaron, drank himself to death. His father, Frederick, was a colossal alcoholic. His brother, Fred, was a colossal alcoholic. So there was that. Also, Cheever, for much of his adult life, was terrified all the time. He was terrified that his very conservative Westchester neighbors would learn that he was secretly bisexual, which was considerably at odds with his image as this paterfamilias squire living in his 18th century stone-ended Dutch farmhouse in Ossining. And he was, of course, terrified that his family would find out, that his sons would find out, and that his wife of 41 long years would find out. I'm reading a bit from my book, kind of about Cheever hitting bottom, which happened in 1974 when he went to teach at Boston University. The year before, he had taught at the Iowa Workshop, and it had gone remarkably well for a person, in the last stages of suicidal alcoholism, and he was rather proud of himself. And he came home and boasted incessantly to his family about how sexually irresistible he had been to the young women at Iowa. For whatever reason, his family wasn't very receptive to this, and Cheever became embittered, and said, if I just leave you awful people, then everything will be just fine. So he was going to go to Boston. And I think he expected the family to say, oh no, please stay. And they didn't. They were kind of worn out, and I think that they didn't really think he'd last long at Boston. He was sort of an invalid at that point, and he was a man who was sort of congenitally incapable of doing his own laundry. So that would prove to be a problem, as you will see. One last thing, I want to emphasize before I read this, that in 1975, Cheever went to the Smithers Rehabilitation Center in New York and got sober. And he never took another drink in the last 7 years of his life. Cheever's life has been called, understandably, a kind of redemptive fable. In 1977, 2 years after Smithers, he published Faulkner, his novel, which made #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. He was on the cover of Newsweek. The next year, he published The Stories of John Cheever, which won the Pulitzer and every other prize, and so on. But if you read my book, you will see that life remained a problem for Cheever, even in those years. Last thing I'm going to say, I will approximate Cheever's weird accent, because I think it's important you get a sense of his public persona. It was very important to Cheever that he be perceived as this sort of Massachusetts Brahmin, which he wasn't. His father was a shoe salesman. But Philip Roth pointed out, it wasn't really a Massachusetts accent at all. It was more of like a upper-class New York, like Plimpton, right? And a guy named Jerry Mangione, who had worked with Cheever at the Federal Writers Project in the 30s, said, I knew John before he had an accent. Okay, without further ado. By way of declaring his independence, one of the first things Cheever did in Boston was order stationery. John Cheever, 71 Bay State Road, Boston, Massachusetts, 02215. This enabled him to write despondent letters about how much he despised his new lodgings, and never mind the sinister part of town where he found himself, Kenmore Square, part student, part slum, whose most prominent features was a school for embalming, or so he rarely failed to point out. At his peremptory and belated request, an apartment had been found for him in a handsome Beaufront brownstone on a leafy street near campus, though it was hardly ideal for a lonely alcoholic with a bad heart. Not only was it 4 flights up, but the interior was bleak, and Cheever was disinclined to personalize it. His main attitude was one of bewilderment. He worked hard all his life, attained the pinnacle of his profession, only to be banished by his family to 2 furnished rooms in Boston where he expected to end up penniless and naked like his poor grandfather Aaron, what with the predations of the Plymouth Rock laundry. As for his relations with the university, they began with delinquencies on both sides and went downhill from there. As a last-minute replacement for Gene Stafford, who was allegedly drinking even more than Cheever, the relatively obscure Ivan Gold had been hired to teach the other workshop section. Consequently, most students had requested Cheever, whose classes were swamped. He repeatedly asked that the situation be remedied, but found the administration quite mysterious at best. The head of the English department wasn't returning his calls. He finally met the man by accident standing at an adjoining urinal, and George Starbuck at the writing program seemed alarmed at the very sight of him. I did not rise to the occasion of John's trouble, Starbuck later admitted, did not effectively love or help him, floundered stupidly between catering to him and pursuing some coherent plan of stern but supported intervention. And yet his wariness was at least somewhat understandable, since Cheever, quite apart from his disastrous alcoholism, had given signs of being very high maintenance indeed. First, he demanded that Starbuck find him suitable lodgings. Then he let it be known that Iowa had provided him with a graduate student who served as a kind of secretary come mistress come nurse. And he expected BU to do the same. As Starbuck recalled, there was carefully plenty of twinkle in his voice as he urged this, but he did urge it, and tell me that he needed just that to keep him on an even keel. Starbuck, however, balked at playing procurer, even for so distinguished a colleague, whose invidious comparisons between Iowa and Boston usually ended with, "And every night in Iowa there was someone to suck my cock." For the first month or so, Cheever was able to function as a teacher, precisely because he drank before class, vodka mostly, since it was relatively odorless. He remained fairly alert and often held forth in an engaging way. He assigned drills as ever, though they were received with even less enthusiasm than at Iowa. As an exercise in describing the indescribable, one of his students, a semi-famous novelist's son who fancied himself experimental, read an endless list of synonyms for death from Roget's Thesaurus. A long silence followed. "It's a found object," the young man explained. Cheever threw his head back and studied the ceiling. "From now on," he said at length, "all found objects shall be designated F.O.s." Not surprisingly, Cheever couldn't be bothered to read his students' work outside of class, seeming to think it was more than sufficient having to listen to it. Asked about a large manuscript on his coffee table, a novel, as it happened, by the semi-famous novelist's son, Cheever closed his eyes and shook his head. When, however, he returned the manuscript exactly 1 week after the Epigone had given it to him, he declared it perfect. "Submit it to a New York publisher and they'll publish it right away." "I never got it published," the author reported 30 years later. All graduate students, in fact, were required to get 2 professors to read and sign off on their thesis work, and whenever they managed to run Cheever to ground and ask for his signature, he was always happy to give it. "Oh yes, this was very good," he mumbled if they asked his opinion of the work in question. Whatever remained of Cheever's willpower was entirely reserved for showing up. Outside the classroom, he barely functioned at all. His most constant companion, at least that first semester, was a graduate student named Lawrence Schwartz, who'd been one of Robert Penn Warren's proteges at Yale. Perhaps because of this connection, Cheever had recommended the young man for a full scholarship at BU. Schwartz endeavored to return the favor. Since Cheever, quote, had a tendency to walk out of his apartment nude, unquote, Schwartz would meet him several mornings a week to make sure he was properly dressed. Trembling from head to toe, unable to speak, Cheever would walk with Schwartz to a seedy hotel bar on the way to campus where a rock-faced waitress in a miniskirt would wordlessly bring her only customer a double vodka on the rocks. As Schwartz recalled, Cheever was like one of those toy birds who peck at a water glass. Where am I? He'd lower his head, say, come on, lower his head again. Maybe halfway through, he'd finally be able to pick up the glass. He'd also tentatively attempt speech, and after a few garbled phrases, he'd begin to make some sort of sense, whereupon he'd become tearful, as if his words were unbearable to hear. His life was such a mess. He had no clean clothes. The proprietor of the Plymouth Rock laundry was abandoned, and for 2 weeks he'd subsisted on nothing but hamburgers and oranges. On it went. Meanwhile, he tried to light a cigarette, the matches falling one after another from twitching fingers. Schwartz, snatching the embers out of Cheever's lap, once counted 30 matches to light a single cigarette. Over and over, Schwartz implored the decrepit man to see a doctor, but Cheever seemed more interested in maundering about his woes than in doing much about them. It was like taking care of a child, Schwartz said, echoing his various predecessors. As for John Updike, he too was estranged from a wife named Mary and living in Back Bay about a mile from Cheever. The similarities ended there. They met by accident in September outside Brooks Brothers, where Cheever had invited Updike to join him while he blithely purchased a pair of tasseled loafers, though the tassels gave him very slight pause. That done, the two adjourned to the Kontiki bar at the Park Plaza, where Cheever instructed the waiter with great urgency to bring him doubles, as if a drink that was merely single might in its weakness poison him. Saying goodbye on Commonwealth, Updike paused to watch his wobbly colleague walking away under the elms. I felt badly, he remembered, because it was as though a natural resource was being wasted, although the covetousness in me and stony heart kind of rejoiced to see one less writer to compete with. Cheever likewise noted the conspicuous ego clash between the two, and yet remained galled as ever by Updike's failure to cultivate warmer relations. Updike never calls me, he complained. We bump into each other and it's like old times, but he never calls me. Updike did, in fact, call him, but at measured intervals. One night, he came to take Cheever to Symphony Hall and was disconcerted when the older man emerged naked on his fourth-floor landing, while the door slowly swung shut behind him. Fortunately, there was no automatic locking mechanism, and Updike assumed the role of a dutiful, if slightly exasperated son. Quote, Cheever's costume indicated some resistance to attending symphony, but I couldn't imagine what else, and I grimly concentrated on wedging him into his clothes. Later, reading Falconer, Updike seemed to recognize the novel's first sentences as the very ones he'd spotted on a sheet of paper stuck in Cheever's typewriter. Always the same dusty sheet, unaltered. Whether Cheever made any further progress in Boston is unlikely. Warren Schwartz observed that Cheever could hardly type. Quote, he used his forefingers, punching out each letter at 1 second intervals. He wrote 2 lines and suddenly faded out, unquote. The reason he made that one attempt in Schwartz's presence, drunk, late at night, was that he intended to rewrite one of the young man's stories. I'm going to get it published for you. Having mentioned that he'd rewritten minor heroism for Alan Gurganus and even parts of Updike. This, of course, was the pathetic braggadocio of a man who hadn't done a first-rate piece of work, as he saw it, since Bullitt Park 6 years before, and had begun to suspect his career and perhaps his life was over. When his agent, Canada Donadio, sent him a copy of the acclaimed new novel by Joseph Heller, Something Happened, Cheever read a few pages and threw it out the window because he liked it. Any questions? Yes?
It seems that most late writers are alcoholics. I wonder why that is. Does alcohol unleash the creativity?
It's my opinion that, first of all, as far as alcohol unleashing creativity, Cheever almost never, I mean, with only one exception I can think of, and this was shortly before he finally got sober, almost never drank when he wrote. But his writing in the morning became shorter and shorter and shorter, because he wanted to get down to the pantry. I find that American writers are especially susceptible to alcoholism, except for the Jewish writers of the first rank. They're comparatively well-adjusted. Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, no problems with alcohol. But with the Goy, I know of no exception, and help me with this, but I know of no exception among American writers of the first rank except John Updike. And we may learn in his biography that he was, a roaring, solitary drinker or something. I think that is, and this is certainly loomed large in Cheever's life, our culture is peculiarly antipathetic toward artists, even artists of the most exquisite genius. Cheever, when he lived in the suburbs, when he lived in Scarborough on Hudson, he quickly discovered that all of his neighbors fancied themselves the peers of Milton, as he put it, because at cocktail parties, they'd say, "Well, what do you do?" On the rock. And invariably they would reply, "Oh, well, if I didn't have to work, I would have written any number of novels by now." That's the stuff you have to put up with. You're not made the Minister of Culture like Andre Malraux. You're not elected president like Václav Havel. I mean, artists just aren't esteemed in this culture. It's something almost shameful, especially during the 40s and 50s when Cheever was at his height. Thanks. Good question. Yes?
What is it that drew you to want to write about this particular individual?
Well, I am, first of all, he's one of my 2 or 3 favorite writers. My previous biography was of Richard Yates, also a great chronicler of the post-war suburban middle class. He wrote Revolutionary Road. And he lived in the same gatehouse as Cheever on the Vanderlip estate in Scarborough. How's that for a nutty, nutty coincidence? Anyway, so I love Cheever's writing, and also, I mean, people, I like to write about white men who drink too much. I mean, I can't tell you I'm working on now, but you would note a thematic progression. And also, I like the people who have very compartmentalized personalities. That was certainly true where Yates was concerned. Yates was outwardly very much the gentleman, rarely went out in public without, Brooks Brothers suit, and he had sort of a stammer, and just very courtly and charming man. He also had the foulest mouth on the planet. He was given to ungovernable rages, and he lived in these apartments of just Dostoevskian squalor. So, that's interesting to me. And Cheever, you don't do justice to say his personality was compartmentalized. I mean, it was just a hive of paradoxes, though I like to think they're nicely reconciled in my book. Anyone else? Yes, Charlie.
This is really perhaps a question for Ben. Why would this family give you access?
Why would this family give me access? I have a ready-made response to that. Yardley seems bemused.
I don't want you ever to write about me.
No. I hear that sort of thing all the time. Actually, what happened was Janet Maslin, Ben's wife, reviewed my Yates book for the Daily New York Times and gave me the best review I will ever get. Really wonderful. And she pressed the book on Ben, and Ben got in touch with me and wrote a kind note and invited me to come to Pleasantville and be on his cable TV book show. And I was thrilled to do that, and we did it. And afterwards, I had hesitated to do a Cheever biography because I wanted to be, as I was with Yates, the first biographer of whoever I did next, and I liked the pioneering aspect of it. And Ben let me know, and said there had been a previous biography by Scott Donaldson in 1988. And in so many words, Ben told me that, given Donaldson's biography, mine would effectively be the first biography. I'm knocking Scott. That's mean. He's a perfectly nice guy. But what he meant by that was that Donaldson did not have access to Cheever's 4,300-page, single-space typed journal, only 5% of which has seen the light of day. And you really, why bother? And he couldn't quote from letters. It was just a big mess. So that's why you really. Yes.
What finally drives Cheever into the hospital?
Things went from bad to worse, if you can believe it, at Boston. And his beloved brother Fred found him in a very bad way and drove him back to Austin. And his doctor said, not for the first time, said, John, you need to choose whether you're going to live or die. And on the whole, he decided he wanted to live. And again, there is a decided heroic aspect to the last years of Cheever's life. And needless to say, his personality underwent a considerable change for the better when he was sober. Thank you.